are these investments, whether they're in the natural resources section or they're in infrastructure or in construction, are they hiring Africans? So there's this question, do Chinese only hire other Chinese? Are the Chinese harsher as employers? So I don't know if we have data around this. And then from there, we'll go into the Q&A.
There, if I may, there are a number of research papers that have been written that track kind of Chinese hiring and this question that Chinese don't hire locally. I think it's been proven that the longer a Chinese company is in a given African country, the more localized it becomes, right? So that means that initially Chinese firm might bring in their own Chinese workers because of language and cultural considerations and things like that. But typically, the longer a Chinese company is in country, the more and more Africans it will hire. It also depends on the sector. And I would argue that this is a question that really speaks to the African context. One of the things that's been researched in a number of different papers is the impact of local African politics on kind of the way Chinese companies operate. So for example, if there's an election coming up and the incumbent wants to ensure that they get the votes that they need, but there's a particular area that doesn't have a road, it will often push to get that road built in time to capitalize on the votes, right? And under circumstances like that, where there is either limited local capacity or limited time frame in which they have to complete a project, those are the instances when they might actually bring in Chinese workers, because it's illegal to force local Africans to work 24/7 around the clock to complete a project. But the Chinese who are contracted to do that, they can force their Chinese workers to, you know, kind of quickly finish up a project, right? Quite cheaply, to meet the kind of local demands. And so what we've seen is in the past is where Chinese labor was brought in large numbers, it often had to do with a lack of local capacity. So if you look at places like the DRC and Angola, about a decade ago, you know, maybe even a little bit longer, when there was very little capacity, you know, and even things like driving vehicles and kind of complex engineering things, right? Under those types of circumstances, they would bring in their own workers, and where there was a time crunch, right, where things had to be done in very rapid time period, then again, they might bring in Chinese workers. But overall, the trend has been that the longer a Chinese company is in country, the more locals it will hire. And there's no question that on Chinese projects, whether it's in mining or infrastructure or particularly in manufacturing, that it's creating jobs. And it's creating jobs where there are very few other companies, whether domestic or other international, that are creating the numbers of jobs for locals as these Chinese enterprises.
I would just add briefly that, you know, as Yoon said, there are several working papers and also you know, several research articles showing how you know, Chinese companies are increasingly hiring African workers overall. Now there is maybe a variation in the sense that at the management level, in some cases, it's still, you can still find more Chinese, you know, managers and then, you know, African workers. But again, that's also shifting, and it depends also on the type of enterprise. You know, when you look at the tech sector, for instance, it's different. it's different from, the infrastructure one. In the tech sector, companies like Huawei hire also more African managers. And in some countries, the head of Huawei, the director, is a local African person. So there's this, I won't say it's a trend, but this policy, of Africanizing management in Chinese companies. And that's not only Chinese. You can also sense that with other Western companies as well. French banks in Francophone Africa, for instance, telecom, the South African, telecommunications, or even also French telecommunications operators. But in the at the infrastructure level, and that's why it's important, again, to unpack all this when we are talking about Chinese workers. Which sector are we talking about? Well, what are the variations within, from one sector to another, and sometimes within these regimes? It's important to go, as deep as possible into these type of questions.